Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast, coffee break sessions presented by Strategic Treasurer, covering foundational topics and core Treasury issues in about the same amount of time it takes you to drink your cup of coffee. I'll be your host, Jason Campbell, Business Development Leader at Strategic Treasurer. Welcome back for another great episode of the Coffee Break Session. I'm looking forward to these next few episodes as we move the conversation to focus a little bit more on payments. So chatting with me today is Craig Jeffery, Managing Partner at Strategic Treasurer. Craig, glad to have you on today.
It's good to be here, Jason.
It's been a while since you've actually been on the coffee break sessions. I know that you've been a busy guy, so we're really looking forward to this episode and actually the next couple of ones that we're going to do along the way here. And as we get into spring, as we're in this wonderful, the birds are chirping, the flowers are about to be blooming, and the sun's going to be shining. I'm sure we're all looking forward to getting out of winter, and nothing better off to kick us off with some payment activity.
Well, it's been good to hear you and Paul talking about all manners of investments, finances, and economic things. That's been good.
Yeah. And it's, we had some great dialogue, great conversations in regards to those topics. And as we kind of shift focus into a little bit, as we talked about debt and capital, now let's get some payment activity going here. So let's kick off this session to talk a little bit about automated clearinghouse, otherwise known as ACH. So let's go right into it, Craig. So can you walk the audience about what exactly is ACH?
Well, the Automated Clearinghouse and NACHA, National Automated Clearinghouse Association, or the name that they used to, or the abbreviation that they used to use for that, is those two things are different, but they're oftentimes used synonymously. So NACHA is the governing body of electronic payments. This was formed way back in 1974. So it was created in 1974. So that's the association or the governing body, and ACH is the network that moves electronic payments in the U.S. And back in 2021, $73 trillion worth of payments moved through the ACH network, which is about 3 times what the current GDP is. So pretty big movement of funds through the network.
So I know, from a standpoint of individually, how ACH impacts me, but let's talk about a little bit more on the commercial side of things. And what is ACH really used for?
Well, across the board, it's used for things like direct deposit or payroll. That would be the consumer side. It might be used for corporate payments or concentration, moving funds between accounts. It can be used for different types of debits where you're essentially pulling money. It's used for electronic methods as opposed to paper-based transfers. One of the things about the ACH network is it's historically been this batch forward system. So people submit large batches, let's say, of payroll or of corporate AP payments. There's a huge batch that gets sent to the bank. The value date might be the next day or 2 days later. And so it gets processed and then settles on the day or the settlement date, which is usually the next day or the next business day, the next banking day, or the next banking day after that.
So I know for me personally, I know that, when there's opportunities where I can pay for things, from an ACH perspective, and hey, automatic drafts, it's an ACH debit or things of that nature. I'm yeah, game on, because it just eases the way that I do business in my day-to-day life. I don't know, is it similar to that, in a business mindset? If I'm a business owner and or somebody, not saying business owner, but even from an AP perspective or an AR, I guess, from account receivable, right? Since it's payments, is that kind of the similar sentiment? Is it an ease way of getting payments?
Well, I think it depends on the mindset of the company or the person, but from an AR perspective, receiving your payments with an ACH is a pretty effective way of getting payments. It's very inexpensive. The money comes in. You don't have to worry about checks or expensive transactions. It's low cost, very efficient, and oftentimes you're getting notification a day or two earlier of your payment. So you have good information about when your payment's going to come in. That's a pretty helpful feature on the receipt side. On the payment side, the adoption is a little bit slower, and usually that stems from one of a couple of things. One, this older notion of, hey, I want to deal with the mail float, and so I want to mail checks and let them go through the postal service and eventually get there and deal with all the calls and think, hey, this is great. I'm dealing with all this extra float. I have a financial benefit, which is not necessarily great because you could still target your ACH payments to hit on the date you want them to clear. The idea of on the payment side, it's less expensive to clear through the banking system. Electronic payment methods continue to decrease in cost. whereas paper methods or some of the other methods tend to increase. And so I'm just comparing ACH to check. There's obviously lots of other payment methods. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
No, it does. I just think about from an ease perspective, I think ACH is just one of those, it's a convenient option. I'm all about convenience. I love convenience. And I'm sure many people look at that as a pure advantage when it comes to that. So I know that you were mentioning. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, one of your points, like on the consumer side, like if you have let's say your water bill, some people are like, no, I want to write a check or I want to initiate a payment through a portal. Even if it drafts my account, I want to control it. So usually you have the ability through these portals to control when the payments hit your account. The debits would pull the money out of your account to pay your utility, or you can set it up so it automatically comes out with a predetermined date. Those tend to be quite a bit easier than perhaps some other methods. Sometimes if you use a card and the card, you have fraud and they change the numbers or you make changes, then you have to go back to the 10 vendors you're paying with and make those changes. Now, some of the card companies have gotten much better about maintaining consistent payments, even with an old, compromised credit card number to keep those going. But this is just an easy way to eliminate. Now I have to do something to pay for my water or to pay for my electricity. It automatically occurs.
Right. So I know, like earlier in the conversation, you were talking about Nacha, and you kind of go back to that for a quick second there. Kind of walk us through, are there any standards that regulate ACH domestically or even globally?
Yeah, certainly. So as far as a governing body, the Nacha is the association that helps set the rules and help guide those rules. There's different regulations, like in the Uniform Commercial Code. There's regulations that guide that. A lot of people think of Reg E and some of the other regulations that exist govern that. That's probably more than we can cover in a coffee break session, but there's certainly a number of regulations that are more uniform. The Uniform Commercial Code covers essentially most of the U.S., essentially all the U.S., for requirements if there's fraud or the rules of signing up or breaking terms for, let's say, an automatic payment that you have. Let's say for a gym membership, right? You canceled it, but they keep debiting you, and how do you dispute that? So there's rules that govern that both within the Nacha rule book as well as within some of the regulations in the Uniform Commercial Code.
So how safe is ACH? Like I was saying, like we talk about, there's a lot of convenience. There's a lot of advantages to that. Obviously it's a regulated way to have payments occur. And, not only just how safe is it, but is there anything in particular to watch out for?
Well, ACH payments are still quite safe. They've definitely seen an uptick in the amount of fraud that's occurred. And part of that is everyone continues to put more and more defenses on their payment methods. So things like virtual cards have gotten used more heavily. Very hard to break one-time use cards. So where the criminal's going, they're going where they can get money, where they can still find some way of penetrating a system or creating a way of extracting funds out of a company. So they're very safe. For a consumer, I think they're extremely safe. You have a long period of time to review and check over your statements. If there's something fraudulent, you can back it out. On the corporate side, I think they're quite safe too. If you're initiating payments and you have a regular process of reviewing to make sure that you're reviewing all of your accounts on a daily basis. You're looking at the debits and credits that come out to make sure that all of those credits you sent out, they match up with the batches that your systems had generated. And any debits occur and come from a single account or a designated account for debits where a third party would debit your account. That way, any other type of debit that may hit would be quickly identified. In addition to that, there's a number of services, security services, that banks offer to limit and restrict ACH, debits from hitting your account. So there's, debit filters, debit blocks. There's, depending on the system that the bank is using, what's sometimes referred to as electronic pre-authorization, where certain designations exist to allow someone to come and debit the account. Let's say a taxing authority or your healthcare system, so that they can still have their efficient way of debiting you, and yet you're blocking everything else but that. But it's not there's no problems with any payment system. There are some challenges there on the fraud side, but there's security services. So you have to be mindful on the fraud side for everything.
Right. Well, it's like anything else, right? You got to have a systematic approach to your checks and balances. You got to make sure that, credits and debits, everything lines up, right? Just to make sure that there's nothing going on, and having safe, secure protocols, just like any other payment monitoring and payment security, right? Completely understand. Well, thank you, Craig, for joining me today. Really do appreciate it. It was great, having a conversation and really talking with our listeners around, ACH and giving us some insight behind that. And for our listeners, please ensure to tune in every first and third Thursday of the month for a new episode of the Coffee Break Session. As usual, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, send us a note at podcast@strategictreasurer.com. Until next time, take care.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.